Yes, it's a big hello and a big grin from the catacombs of the ESMT here in Berlin. The Global Solutions Summit 2022 is, of course, as you know, hybrid. That is, a couple of sessions are taking place on the big stage, and some of them are digital, which means that there is a possibility of more discussion with you, dear audience, members of the audience. We're all together here to address the distributional issues of carbon pricing. My name is Connie, but I'm just your moderator. The whole session has been put together by Professor Sonja Peterson of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. And let me just in 2 words tell you why we're talking about it. And everybody knows that we want to hit as a global community the 1.5 degree arrangement that we've all met or made in Paris in 2015. Right at the moment, we're on a trajectory of 2.5 to 2.7, though there needs to be a lot of help on a lot of sides. One of the issues that seems to be the low-hanging fruit is actually giving carbon a price, which we hadn't done up to now. Concepts like that had been out and about and implemented by several countries already 15 years ago. Now it seems to become a mainline effort, and the question mark still exists. Is it equitable? Is it reaching everybody? Is it just a way carbon pricing might hit people that might not want to be hit by it? One of the examples is, of course, the movement of the Gilets jaunes in Paris, France, that started in October 2018, and the good idea was met with a lot of process. Now, our scientists have looked into things, and we'll be going to hear from Sonja just in a moment about the recently concluded study of the Energy Modeling Forum on carbon pricing. And before I introduce Sonja, let me just quickly introduce everybody else who is going to talk to us. We say hello to Brussels, and there we see Frank Siebern. He is head of unit of Fair and Green Digital Transitions Research. He's been leading the work on the Commission's proposal for a council recommendation on ensuring a fair transition to climate neutrality. So thank you very much, Frank, for having dialed in. I now look to the US, and thank you for, well, maybe getting up relatively early, Susie Kerr, as chief economist of EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund. And that is a wonderful organization that calls itself All In on Climate, the greatest challenge of our time, bringing right problem solvers together, the challenges that are being brought about by actually rubbing shoulders and getting organizations together and giving your insight. You'll be doing that in a moment. Thank you, Susie, for dialing in. Then we have Emma Cox on the line, global climate leader at PwC in the United Kingdom, a company that itself has climate measures and has a zero target for the company is running itself, but also in its commitment is trying to assist and help the companies that it's working with. So Emma Cox leads and delivers the global climate strategy, which now lets me get started with Sonja, because she's going to share with you the results of the study right at the beginning. She's currently the head of the service unit, research coordination and outreach, and she's been for the last 5 years honorary professor at Kiel University. Been thinking about the issues that we're talking about for the last round about 20 years, whether it might be EU emissions trading system or other aspects of making us pay and get a good economic balance and a good economic outlook on helping us reach our goals. So maybe Sonja Peterson, Sonja, please take it away and explain to us what the result of your studies were.
Yeah, thank you, Connie, very much for this. Thank you very much for this introduction. Let me briefly share my screen here. I hope you should all be seeing it now. Let me use these first 10 minutes of this session to give you a very brief introduction about some relevant results of the project Carbon Pricing After Paris, which was funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, and is in its core a multi-model comparison study within the framework of Stanford University's Energy Modeling Forum. And me, together with Professor Christoph Böhringer from Oldenburg University, actually coordinated this project. And today I want to focus on some relevant results on distributional implications of carbon pricing. So what was our general focus of this study? Well, the study was basically about quantifying the medium term, so in our case, 2030 economic impacts of carbon pricing to reach alternative emission reduction targets related to the Paris Agreement, so the nationally determined contributions, and under different degrees of international cooperation. And in this project, we focused on these economic impacts on the global and also the aggregated national level, but we also had a focus on the effects of carbon pricing for different household types. And that's what I want to focus on here mostly. But before I will do so, let me very briefly, in a nutshell, summarize the findings on the implications of carbon pricing. And that's probably nothing new, but I think it's important to stress it again and again. And that is that harmonized carbon pricing can lead to significant cost savings to reach given emission or climate targets. And what we actually found in this multi-model exercise, where we had some 15 models participating, by the way, also one from EDF, thanks for that. The core finding is that if you look at the costs that occur for reaching the currently submitted pledges under the Paris Agreement, if you compare these costs to the costs and if these targets are reached in an uncoordinated unilateral way, and if you compare these costs to the costs that would occur if you have much more stringent targets that would be in line with the 2 degrees Celsius temperature goal, but which are reached with international cooperation and a globally uniform carbon price, these would actually be kind of equal. So the takeaway is that you could ratchet up the current targets kind of cost neutrally towards what is needed if you implement uniform carbon pricing. So that's a strong argument for carbon pricing. But what one should also not forget is that different stakeholders are affected differently. Of course, that's true on the country level, but that's also true on the household level. And that is why a subset of the models participating in this study, some 10 models, disaggregated the economic impacts for specific countries, EU countries, India, Brazil, China, for different household types. And what they did is they differentiated between so-called income deciles. So they looked at the effects for the 10% poorest households, the next 10% poorest households, up to the 10% richest households. And for a cross-model comparison, they looked at a harmonized scenario where the revenues from national carbon pricing to reach the Paris pledges are recycled back in equal shares to the households. And the main finding of this cross-model comparison is shown in this graph, which is maybe less complicated than it looks. So let me briefly walk you through it. So on the x-axis, we have these different income deciles. So H01 are the 10% poorest households, and then up to H10, which would be the 10% richest households. And then on the y-axis, you have the welfare effects on these households, where you can basically think of reductions in the consumption possibilities of these households. And now let us first look at these blue parts, parts of the graph. This actually shows the effects for the different households on the expenditure side. What does it mean? It means carbon pricing implies that prices for energy increase. So households have to spend more on the same goods and services, so they have some negative consumption effects. And these strange kind of looking plots there, they show the green triangle is actually the mean effect across the models included. This line in the middle is the median effect, and these boxes, these blue boxes, show where the core of the model results are located, and then these so-called whiskers, these lines, they show the range of model results. And what you see there, if you look at the blue part of the graph, is that there is a slight tendency that poorer households tend to suffer more from carbon pricing than richer households. And this is because poorer households spend a larger share of their income on energy. And this is a finding that has been found before, what it's stressed here in this multi-model context again. Now, if you take the money from carbon pricing and recycle it back to households, you also have an income effect. And that is here shown in orange in the same logic as before. And what you can see is that actually now poor households benefit much more from this same refunding of carbon revenue. And that is because the same amount of money means a much larger relative increase in income for poorer households. So their consumption possibilities, their welfare increase much more than those of the rich households. And you see that there you have a clear tendency that this is a so-called progressive effect, and poorer households benefit more. And overall, the result is this line in the middle, this blue line with the blue dots, and this shows the overall effect. And you see that through this revenue recycling, you could turn this kind of unfair, regressive expenditure effect where the poor suffer more to an overall progressive effect where actually poor households benefit much more. If you look at country-specific results of the different models, these general findings hold for all analyzed countries, which include EU countries, US, Brazil, China, and India. But there's also a second important finding is that some of these specific studies look also at the trade-off between equity issues. So you would want to use this revenue to make the outcome more equitable, and efficiency. And for efficiency, unfortunately, it would be better. So if you use the revenues from carbon pricing to lower some taxes, for example, income or labor taxes, and that would maximize or minimize the national impact of carbon pricing. And several studies show that this is, for example, the case in the studies for Austria, US, and China, but there's also country studies like for Brazil where you don't have these trade-offs. There are then more specific findings in our studies. For example, the study on Austria, they differentiate between households at the periphery and in the center, and they show that households at the periphery suffer more from carbon pricing because they have more energy consumption for commuting. And very interesting result is also found for the US, which looks at scenarios that try to balance these equity concerns and efficiency concerns, and find that if you combine a targeted transfer to just the poor household with a reduction in payroll taxes, that achieves the best balance between these two targets. And maybe the last result is that if you look at the incidence on the global level, already achieving the submitted pledges means that on a global level, richer households suffer more because they are mostly in richer countries which have stricter targets. Okay, so let me finish with 3 takeaways, which I think are a nice introduction to the following discussion. And that is carbon pricing, and I would say also more generally, climate policies or policies limiting the use of fossil fuels affect poorer households more strongly, because these households spend a larger share of their income on energy and fossil fuels. And that means to achieve a fair and just transition towards climate neutrality, we do need some compensating measures. And our studies shows that part of these measures that's very effective could be a refunding of carbon costs to the households. And finally, I also think that we need not only to look at distributional effects, but really at absolute poverty and impacts of climate policy, especially in developing countries, and poverty need to receive a specific focus. Thank you very much. So that's it from my side, and I'm now looking forward to a lively discussion. Connie, the floor is yours again.
Right, thank you so much. And just very quickly, when you talked about the refunding of households, could you specify again, does that have to be a lump sum or does it have to be measured in percentage? What were the findings or what were the suggestions of your study?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in our study, we had a rather simplified assumption, and there they are really recycled back lump sum in this case, because for modeling reasons that was necessary, not to per capita, not per head, but per household. So each household in our modeling exercise got the same amount of money, but this also works for per capita refunds. And that's, for example, something that's discussed in Germany now, and it's also already implemented in Switzerland.
Thank you so much for specifying that. Now, I'd like to bring in all the discussants with their diverse views and viewpoints. And let me, to everybody else who's chipping in, say that we do have the chat, and whatever ideas you have, whatever questions you have, please send your ideas and questions into the chat, even if we don't have time to address it now. Sonja will definitely copy the chat and get back to you. No, that's a promise, isn't it? So Frank, again, let me recap as the head of the unit of fair, green and digital transition. I mean, here we have all the 3 important bits. Your policies that you're putting out, your frameworks that you're putting out right at the moment, without being fair, they won't be accepted. So how do you make policy decisions and make them fair?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, the question. As was said before, I work in a new unit which was set up in DG Employment in the context of reorganization last summer, which shows the increased attention to this topic. It's not only since last year that we're working on it, it's since at least 2019 or before. And we're also not the lead service, that's with the colleagues in Director Generals for Climate or Energy Policy, but we do accompany this with a focus on just transition aspects as was discussed. And studies like the one just presented are extremely valuable and important for us and of direct relevance to policy making. In this introductory presentation comment, I would like to highlight 4 short points. First, when it comes to climate policy, as was mentioned, our main narrative is to say inaction is not an option, because climate change, as was mentioned before, does hit poorer households, the most vulnerable, even disproportionately. So not doing anything is not an option, even if action is costly. As we see already, climate change and natural hazards have disastrous impacts of people's livelihoods, health and economy, and that would risk being exacerbated without urgent action. It's in that context that the Commission has proposed the Green Deal back in December 2019 to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. It has also set itself a very ambitious emission reduction target of at least 55% by 2030. All of this is enshrined in the first European climate law. It's binding. This is because the Commission, as I said, in addition to the urgency, we have seen that decoupling prosperity, economic growth from emissions was possible to some part, but we need to speed up the action. And the Commission, to reach these targets, has put up a very ambitious legislative package last year of more than 20 measures, so-called Fit for 55 packages, including of which the ETS extension, the emissions trading scheme, to new sectors, so far exempted, buildings and road transport, is one important one. So the ETS in the European Union is the world's first international emissions trading scheme and the flagship policy to combat. But let's say it was felt that as part of the legislative package to reach the more ambitious targets, the extension to these building and road transport sectors was needed because they account for more than 60% of emissions overall, and progress in those sectors in terms of reducing emissions has been slower than in the past. This is not to say that we deny that there are such distributional impacts and issues to be addressed. All of the initiatives of the package have been accompanied by quite extensive impact assessments. They look at employment impacts, they look at distributional impacts to the extent possible, and they have come up, let's say, they do support what was just mentioned. There's similar evidence in our reports that low income and lower middle income households are disproportionately affected, and that revenue recycling measures are needed. And that's why the package also includes some proposals to address these social fairness issues, notably to set up a new social climate fund, which would take part of these additional revenues, 25% a new fund and another 25% matched, that's the proposal, from member state revenues, to help vulnerable consumers, vulnerable households, vulnerable micro enterprises, including through temporary income support where necessary. With this, let me go to a third point quickly. I try to be as quick as I can to say we have an overall positive assessment of the potential outcomes of climate change policies. We say that there's a potential for what we call a triple dividend. It can reduce emissions, it can create jobs overall in the aggregate, and it can improve welfare and health and well-being if we have the right policies in place. So, and you mentioned the recommendation, I'll come to that in a second. As part of the package, we have proposed a council recommendation on ensuring fair transition, which is meant to provide guidance to member states. A lot of the policies mentioned are under the competence of your member states in the European Union. How to bring about such a fair transition, how to address labor and social effects, what are these right policies in place? So we do not deny that the effects on sectors, on employment in sectors, on regions, on skills and labor shortages, potentially also on increasing energy, food prices and others as we see these days. But we admit that there are policies we can use through compensation or others to address tax reduction, or others to address these factors. And our colleagues in the Joint Research Center in Spain help us to do such analysis. Let me also say that we believe that research in some cases like France or Canada has shown that overall people's support for such climate measures, even if they are costly for some income groups, the higher income groups, generally find more support if you do also build in this social dimension, build in a revenue recycling dimension from the start. And my last point I would like to make is we believe that this is, as I said, also part of the Fit for 55 package with this recommendation, which is currently being, the proposal for recommendation should say, which is currently being under negotiation in the European Council among the member states. And I would like to highlight that without going into too much detail, it does recommend to member states that in light of the challenges they are facing, in light of the expected impacts of their the climate policies overall on the different population groups, households, sectors, and so on, they should address, let's say, look at policy packages which cover support to quality employment, quality education overall, retraining, reskilling, upskilling, but also support to fair tax benefit systems and social protection systems and access to essential services, which all have to be part of the package. And so this includes also shifting away taxes, as was mentioned before, for example, from labor to other sources. And a very last point I would like to highlight is part of the recommendation is that we believe that stakeholders need to be involved. So we have to be transparent about the expected impacts, about actual impacts, about the costs, so that we can have an open, regular dialogue with stakeholders as we go along as part of a fair transition policy, and to keep everyone on board. I'll leave it there and thank you very much for this first round.
Well, thank you very much, Frank. Very interesting. I'd love to go back to the triple dividend, but maybe we have a bit of time afterwards, because I'd love to bring in Susie right now. Susie, with your extensive background that spans diverse continents, with your work also in New Zealand on issues like this. Now you're based in the US, so you're monitoring what's going on there. Then you've had the experience in Southern America. So in how far do your experiences in policy making in the countries match with your scientific advice as chief economist?
So for me, the key challenge is that climate mitigation has to be done by everyone, and it has to happen everywhere in the world, and the faster, the better. Because if we don't succeed, as Frank says, everybody, all people will suffer from dangerous climate change. But some communities and countries are really poor, and it's infeasible and it's unfair for them to bear a lot of the costs. And so just a simple statistic, by 2030, more than 70% of emissions and therefore mitigation will be in developing countries. So this is a really huge challenge. So bringing together my economics and my concern about this, I strongly believe that it is possible to create high integrity mechanisms through sort of carbon markets, so that those with more resources bear more of the costs. And all of those who have opportunities to take actions for mitigation, whatever those are, can contribute to mitigation, but at the same time they can thrive. But it takes courage to transform economies deliberately. And the EU has really experienced this. It's not an easy thing to do. And it takes a really significant change in thinking to support change where we're going to have to transfer very large amount of resources to the poorer people who need to take action. So we need to get to a position where richer people and countries not only take the actions that are directly in their control, and that's very good that they're starting there, the actions that are consistent with avoiding dangerous climate change, but that they also recognize their responsibility to bear some of the costs of helping others who have fewer resources also reach net zero. And we're not talking here about a few credits that people are going to buy, but hundreds of billions of dollars of transfers each year and trillions of dollars of investment capital. And that's what the modeling suggests. And the people in countries who have few resources, they need to be confident that they'll have support that will help them to thrive at least as much and preferably more than they are now. We need them to express their willingness to act to reduce climate change in ways that are consistent with avoiding dangerous climate change. And we need them to support policies that will make that happen. And without these changes, I find it really hard to imagine how we're going to achieve the scale and pace of change that we need.
Thank you very much, and sorry for interrupting. The one question that I think we need to get back on is the question of investment finance. We have a lot of greening mechanisms now in the international finance arena, but a lot of them are sort of always under a threat of being put into question, simply because, is this just greening or is it actually doing something? So maybe we keep that question on the way though to Emma. And again, we've seen a lot of changes, seeing that we talk about transformation, and it's almost like operating on an open heart. We're sort of, learning as we go. And we have to do it fast. The need for speed is quite obvious, and we've seen a number of companies, multinational companies, actually in the lead for saying yes, we want to drive the change. So your company is quite obviously one of those that is on that scale. So from a corporate point of view and from an advisory point of view, how do you pick up what Sonja and the other scientists have come up in that study and what we've just heard from Susie?
Thank you very much, Connie, and it's been a fascinating discussion so far, and I think the congruence between everything that Sonja and Frank and Susie have all said is so evident. Starting with what Sonja was saying, we actually did a study that was quite similar, I think, in its conclusions, and we worked with WEF looking at the IMF's proposal for an international carbon price floor, and that asked three things. It said, could an international agreement, because this isn't about doing things piecemeal, we need to do things wholesale on a global scale. Could that reduce emissions? Could it be done without severe economic damage to livelihoods and business? And could it be done without shifting economic activity from one part of the planet to another? Now, these are complex modeling, theoretical studies, but the answer to all three of those is yes, which echoes really what Sonja was saying. But it's complicated, and it's complicated to do it at scale, and it needs all bits of the ecosystem to work together. Those sort of changes can, as Susie and Frank were saying, they can pay for themselves, but only if revenues get back into the hands of the households that need them. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that the consequence of inaction, which others have mentioned, is really scary. So the scale and cost of inaction far outweighs the cost of action. And I think, Connie, that was where you were coming to say, actually, business, the real transformation that's happened in the last few years is that business has really woken up to the fact that governments can't do this alone. Business is going to be affected, people are being affected, and it takes all parts of society to take action in a coordinated way. Now, businesses like a degree of certainty. There's a lot of consensus around the need for carbon pricing, and you see a significant number of businesses now introducing carbon pricing into their own decision making. And as part of making this tide of making net zero commitments that businesses have been doing in the last couple of years as well, that's starting to become much more prevalent. But this is complicated. There isn't one easy switch. You've seen businesses like Certainty, they don't like the volatility that we've seen in the pricing that's around at the moment. They want to make decisions based on things that they can put their arms around. So what's good is that businesses starting to work with policymakers, and dialogues like these are actually really good about listening to each other. It's not things being done in a vacuum. So I think business needs to work with policymakers, governments, civil society, to say, what are the frameworks that are actually going to work in practice? What are the methodologies that we need? How do we bring that in? Things like Fit for 55, as Frank was saying, it's going to make a massive shift, but we need the methodologies, the systems, the measurement, the recording to keep up with that, so that you get the transparency and the trust. Because Connie, you mentioned greenwash. Is it all just hot air? We've had a lot of big promises being made, and we've had a lot of flack being raised where people don't trust in it. So it's up to it's up to all of us to work together for the science to prove it, the methodologies to be clear, the levers to be thought about their impact on households. And then business needs to actually honestly report what it's doing, and be held accountable for the promises that it's made. So I think I would say, I have to be optimistic, because I think if we're pessimistic, nothing's going to happen. I think the glass half full bit is we've made some really good strides, but we need to really accelerate. And what Susie was saying about, the impact is going to be held, amongst the least developed countries in the world is so true. I think from a business perspective, though, the focus of business on its supply chains and its responsibilities with its supply chains is shifting the dial for business to realize that they need to understand and help work with the right solutions all the way up and down their value chain. So long-winded way of saying we're not there yet, but there are green shoots, and the policy framework to give the certainty in which business can operate and make the right investment decisions and accelerate finance at scale, I think is what we need to work towards.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that, Emma. And I think I've heard from several of you saying that we need everybody to chip in, not just the big companies, not just small companies. We need to have this global aspect. And of course, we need to take along citizens and make it understood. Let me just quickly point out, we have 15 minutes left, so maybe shorter interventions now. Sonja, I'll just give you the floor if you want to say something.
I think I would rather use the time to pick up some questions in the chat, and I might actually just start with answering some, and then the others can, or maybe you can post them. There's one question, especially asking about what's the effect for countries with a lot of carbon intensive commodity exports, and that's certainly a problem. It's a problem if countries go first, like the EU, and others don't, and that's maybe a bit different question than in this session. It focuses more on social questions, but of course it will have employment implications, and it's a difficult issue. I'm interested to see if the border carbon adjustment will work in this respect in the EU, but I think the main challenge is actually more for the fossil fuel exporting regions, which will basically lose their major income once the world decarbonizes. And I think that's something one also has to take into account and look for solutions there. Maybe hydrogen can be a solution in some of the countries currently exporting fossil fuels.
Anybody else want to chip in on this answer? Maybe Susie?
Yeah, so I think, and this is obviously a huge challenge, particularly politically. And one way to get a more level playing field is to work with your trade competitors so that they also implement carbon policy. And that might require that you're willing to be generous and transfer significant resources to them and really help. But as well as a CBAM on countries who are lagging but are rich and who you would expect to have strong climate policy, also help the countries who you might not expect on their own to have strong climate policies, so that they also impose those sorts of constraints on their emissions intensive industries.
Lovely, thank you very much. I do take it, William Thompson, it's more a exclamation mark than a question mark with your intervention there. Let's have a look at the carbon pricing, maybe influenced by inflation. Will the inflation incurred by this wave of global increasing commodity price impact the carbon pricing and therefore affect the allocation in the country's climate actions? Now that's a question to the scientists. On the way to answering that, I'd love to get Frank into the discussion with a parallel question that we of course have right at the moment. It's been never as clear how interconnected we are as a global society since the outbreak of the war of Russia in the Ukraine against the Ukraine, and even normal citizens. Yes, I live in a place where there are growing cups. No, being global citizens, we now know how supply chains work. So what's the take of the EU on the shift that may be imposed due to the war?
Thank you. There's a lot in this question. I think first of all, the war is a human tragedy, let's say, which puts a lot of certainties into question we have had, and which obviously has a number of direct and indirect social implications. I think if anything, the answer from the EU was to be fast, to be determined, and to increase the sense of urgency and to accelerate the energy transition in light of what we are living, with a focus to secure energy supply, to increase strategic autonomy, to reduce dependency of fossil fuel imports from Russia, while at the same time maintaining this focus of solidarity we mentioned. And obviously that solidarity not only within the EU or across groups or regions, but also at global level. Yes, this is a global agenda. So what we have done, and what we have to see in the many areas in which we have to take action in parallel, is one, integration of refugees. So there are a lot of actions taken that this can happen fast and that they have access to essential services, education, and so on in the Union, and in Europe and the world at large. Second, obviously, there is an impact of energy prices and also second round effects on food prices and others which need to be dealt with, and households need to be, and enterprises need to be shielded to the extent possible. The fact that energy prices have been rising is not new. So we had a rise since the mid of last year already. The Commission has taken a first action in October last year to present a so-called toolbox of emergency measures member states can take. And almost all have taken such measures, protecting more than 70 million households. That can be tax rebates, social tariffs, many other tools we do mention. What we see now is that the scale of the problem is a very different one, and could be much harsher. And our colleagues I mentioned before at the Joint Research Center have tried to assess what could be distributional welfare impacts of the price hikes, of the excessive price hikes, let's say doubling energy costs, for example, or different scenarios. And they come up with that if unaddressed, they could lead to real welfare losses of up to 10%, increasing unemployment, also increasing energy poverty in the Union. That's obviously something we want to avoid. And the Commission has last point to say, and that was discussed at the Leaders Summit in Versailles in mid-March, presented additional guidance to member states. Member states can use price regulation or other measures under the existing directives. They have been encouraged to use windfall profits, tax windfall profits also for revenue cycling. And last but not least, to, let's say, come up with a plan by May this year, which we will call Repower EU plan, which should lay out how we diversify gas supplies, speed up the rollout of renewables, boost energy efficiency, and replace gas and heating and power generation. So all of this to say, yes, we are living these interdependencies, and CBAM was mentioned before. As I said before, also in that area, there are a lot of parallel initiatives. I don't go into detail, but for example, promoting decent work globally, due diligence for companies, deforestation-free products, or also more general supply chain related issues. We have at COP26 obviously co-signed the Just Transition Declaration and kicked off, for example, a cooperation, Just Energy Transition Partnership with South Africa. So all of this to say, yes, this has to go in parallel, despite the increasing and because of the increasing challenges.
So interesting, and yet I see time running away. Susie, what's the impact, do you think, on the global south? Because it will have impact, and energy and food are just two of the imminent issues. But how would that have to sort of be integrated with carbon pricing?
So I think that it's just, and this terrible war is just another illustration of when we have crises, it's always the poorest and the most vulnerable who suffer most. And the food issues in the Middle East and Africa terrify me. As a mother, I can't imagine anything worse than not being able to feed my children. And I think, there are big issues there about resilience. As an economist, we used to all be in favor of these global trade and supply chain complexity and so on. That's all great, except when you come to absolutely critical human necessities. In terms of carbon pricing, nothing can divert us from the climate crisis. It's not visible like on a day-to-day basis in the way a war is, but it's a crisis that is much larger still. And we need to keep our eyes on that as it slowly evolves and deal with the short-run crises, which are terrible, but in ways that actually keep moving us in the right direction on the longer-term ones.
Yes, and I think some of Frank's answers also sort of covered. I mean, certainly sort of decent work, etc., were also responses, or the increased attention to decent work worldwide was something that was also furthered by COVID-19 responses. Emma, please.
Yeah, I was just going to sort of build on that decent work piece, because I think one of the consequences of the transition is a change in the nature of work and a change from certain industries to others, and the greening of jobs. You hear a lot about that. We've produced our own kind of green jobs barometer. And one of the challenges is that where the new jobs are going to be found are not the same place that the old jobs that were lost. And so we need a very clear, both policy and businesses need to work together on making sure that we generate the skills in the right places. And the proceeds of carbon pricing may be able to be redirected in order to help that actually be encouraged. One point that I'd like to bring out, building on a bit on what Susie said, is women are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate emergencies. And I think we need to really be quite deliberate in understanding how we build the skills and jobs for the new world, the newly transitioned net zero world. Our Women in Work study that we did recently showed 4.3 million more women unemployed than previously. Women have been disproportionately affected by the impacts of the COVID crisis. And there's a staggering statistic, they're 14 times more likely to die in environmental disasters, and they have 70% of the purchasing decisions. So put all of that together, and actually we need a policy environment that actually consciously thinks about how do we put the right products in the right hands at the right prices, and the jobs and skills, so that we have that gender lens as we rebuild, not just gender, but inclusion as a whole. I think is really important, and business has a real part to play in that. Sorry, that was just a build on what you were saying.
Absolutely perfect. I thank you very much for that contribution. And I mean, it's sort of part and parcel of my heart. But then, of course, if women's households on the whole globally, but certainly more on the global south, are the less wealthy, certainly, and quite a number of women are the heads of households, that means that we actually have to, in our context of our discussion right at the moment, take a lot of care about how to compensate for the increase, the necessary increase in carbon pricing. Maybe Sonja, let's come back to you for a quick question and an answer, and then you will actually finish the session, simply because I really have to race upstairs. So how can you make it the compensation measures? Let's face it, we need carbon pricing, and the carbon price in Europe is definitely too low. So how can we find the right measures to actually support those who need it most?
That's a very broad question, and I still would like to come back to where I started from. I think actually the idea of taking part of the revenue and give it back directly to people is a very good idea. It should be also communicated very obviously and transparently that this is money people get back, so that they feel that carbon pricing is not meaning just another tax or price rise. It's the idea is really to incentivize change and not to make people pay more. So I think that's really something very important. And generally, I think it's important to involve people in the discussions, broad stakeholders. There's also good reasons to use the funds for other issues like greening the economy. There's a lot of support for that. There should be definitely funds for developing countries. So I'm very skeptical, by the way, of the approach to see CBAM in the EU as a revenue raising mechanism. It shouldn't be. And I think one should certainly think about, for example, transferring back some of the money to the poorest countries if they need to be covered at all. So I think that's a very important thing. And I think, Connie, you have to run. Thank you very much for moderating. Let me take over here. I would like to give everybody, I think we have 2 minutes, except Connie, one last round of final remarks. So if you want to link to some of the questions in the chat, you can, but you don't have to. So I think we go the opposite way around this time. To be fair, we start with Emma, then Susie, and then Frank. You have kind of the last word before I say goodbye to everybody. So Emma, your last thoughts on this broad topic, something you want us to bring in.
So this is a wonderfully broad topic, as you say, Sonja. We've roamed far and wide, haven't we, from carbon pricing, redistribution, the horrendous challenges of the war in Ukraine. I think I would just say carbon pricing is complicated, but it's not, complication is not a reason for inaction. Let us work together as policymakers, businesses, and civil society to come up with a solution that works for a global, fairer redistribution that works and incentivization that works. But it has to be done at speed. We haven't got time to mess around. So actually bringing in, trying it out, making things happen, I'd encourage us to make it work.
That sounds like a good point. Susie, your few seconds.
So carbon markets, carbon pricing are a really extremely valuable toolkit as part of a package to get reductions to happen. They have to be done in a way that has integrity. and they have to be done in a way that is equitable, or we're not going to get them at the scale that we really need them to happen at.
Thank you. Frank, final words from your side.
Thank you very much. I think I will add the same and quote our executive vice president when he defended the proposal for European climate law in the European Parliament, and he just said the transition has to be just, or there will just be no transition, and that holds at all levels. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I think we had a great mix of panelists here. I'm sorry that we couldn't answer all questions in the chat. Time is always too short here. And I think that not only me, but others are also interested to listen to Mr. Timmermans in a few minutes, who will actually talk on a very similar issue. And that's why Connie had to run, actually, because she's moderating this session live in Berlin. So I think we won't be able to see each other there. I think it's just more like a live stream, but I will certainly look forward to this. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining, everybody. Feel also free to contact me in case you have questions to our study. And yeah, I wish you a nice rest of the day, or however long it is, wherever you are. Thank you very much, and hope to interact with you again.